So I guess we just get right into it. The last case that we talked about, we had a very unfortunate incident happen after the podcast, about a month later.
Yeah.
The gentleman beheaded somebody.
Allegedly, yes.
Allegedly.
Yeah, I thought this one was probably better off just me. Let me think real carefully about the next.
Yeah,
the
I
next
know.
guy.
Jamie and I were both talking about it. Do you think he's going to bring somebody in?
With well over 2,000 episodes of JRE released over the last 15 years, Joe Rogan's had some pretty controversial guests on the podcasts. One of those guests was Sheldon Johnson, and for all of Rogan's talk of assassins and murderers, killers, etc., it was only a matter of time before he had an actual murderer on the show. But there's one thing that we know about our boy Joe. When he fucks up, he does it in the most ironic way possible. You see, Sheldon went on JRE with longtime guest Josh Dubin, a lawyer who advocates for prisoners who were wrongfully convicted. Except when he brought Sheldon on the podcast earlier this year, he was the first guest that was actually guilty, but had supposedly received a harsher than appropriate sentence. Josh helped him to get his sentence reduced to time already served after 23 years in prison.
You don't want somebody to go into the prison system and come out worse.
Right, and which happens.
Most
right?
Of the time. And then we hear about these horrific incidences. Parole board let him out. 2 days later, he pushes somebody into the train tracks, right? This is not what you want. How do you prevent these things from happening, right? By being proactive, by being responsive instead of being reactive. Don't wait for something to happen.
Just a few weeks after he spoke those very words in Joe Rogan's studio, Sheldon would allegedly murder and dismember a former inmate and attempt to hide his body parts in different freezers. But what he didn't realize was that in the 25 years since he'd been in prison, CCTV footage had improved to the point where you could no longer get away with wearing a blonde wig to disguise yourself while moving body parts around in suitcases.
There were so many crazy things to that case. The craziest thing was him trying to fool the security cameras with a wig. Like, I guess he didn't know how high-resolution cameras had gotten over the 25 years that he was in jail.
I mean, apparently there's a lot he didn't know. Based on the surveillance,
it doesn't look good.
What do they say in Texas? It ain't too shiny.
It's so crazy because, we went out with him that evening. We brought him to the comedy club. He was hanging out with us in the green room. And then the news broke. And then the comics were all like, hey, man, what the fuck? What the fuck are you doing bringing that guy around? I'm like, well, we didn't know.
I'm as shocked over it now as I was in the moment. I mean, it's really not funny. I mean, I'm only laughing out of sort of nervousness, I guess.
Of course.
I called him a miracle on this show. And the media shoved that straight up my ass. I mean,
of course, but that's what they're going to do.
So I'm going to get into this episode in a lot more detail in just a moment because it ended up turning into a therapy session for Josh Dubin, who, as you can imagine, feels partly guilty for his role in getting Sheldon out of prison early, only for him to go out and commit one of the most gruesome crimes possible. I'll give you my opinion on whether Josh has anything to answer for, or if this was just an unfortunate incident outside of his control. And there was something that I noticed as this conversation went on that's very similar to the conversations Rogan has with his comedy buddies. So I'll get to that in a moment because, speaking of comedians, did you hear what Rogan said in that previous clip about how he felt betrayed by Sheldon because he brought him to the infamous comedy mothership green room to hang out with some of the top 250 comedy assassins? What did Ron White say about how exclusive the green room is?
The best thing about the green room is how restrictive it is, that you just can't go in there. You're just not, you got to earn that spot in the treehouse, and so anytime you open the door, you'll see, some of the best comics alive sitting there talking about stand-up comedy and, writing jokes and laughing and having a good time. But, that's our little space, man, and it is the greatest thing on earth.
Well, it turns out all of Rogan's buddies who are supposedly murderers get upset when they meet an actual murderer. But for those of you who don't know the full picture, this was Josh Dubin's 8th appearance on JRE, his first going back to 2020. He's a civil rights attorney who advocates for people who have been wrongfully imprisoned, and he brings some of them onto the podcast to tell their story and spread awareness for all of the work that he does. However, Sheldon Johnson was not wrongfully convicted. He was actually guilty of his crimes, but the difference was he supposedly received a much harsher than necessary sentence relative to the crimes that he pleaded guilty to.
Well, he was the only guy that you had ever brought in that was actually guilty, that you felt was in jail for too long. You know, he got a 50-year sentence, correct?
70.
70, and he was reduced to 25?
It was just
20
basically time served. He
served.
did about 30 years, and they resentenced him.
So I think Dubin misspoke there. Sheldon said he originally got a 50-year sentence. I'm not sure where he got that 70 years from. Maybe it sounded better in his head. But if you go back to Sheldon's appearance on JRE from earlier this year, he explained the crimes he was guilty of and how he ended up getting such a harsh sentence. And one of the things that stuck out for me was how much he downplayed his crimes, making them out to be common assaults where nobody actually got hurt, rather than being honest that each incident included multiple felonies, which all contributed to such a long sentence. It's a shame Rogan's bullshit detector was malfunctioning that day, but stick around because wait until I tell you about Sheldon's father and son.
I caught the gun charge that triggered the felony that it allowed them to be able to sentence me the way that they did in 1994. 2 people in particular I gave consignment to, and I ended up getting arrested for a case. And when I sent someone to go pick up the money from them, they kind of just was like, whatever, I'm not paying them.
You got arrested for something. You're in jail.
Yes.
These guys figure since you're in jail, it, we're not going to pay him.
Yeah, I'm not going to pay him.
And then the case that you were arrested for got dismissed.
Got dismissed.
Right,
I got
so
acquitted.
So then you come home.
So then I come home and, I need my money. I gave you something and we had an understanding that you were going to pay me. And when I came home, when I finally located this particular individual, he had his girlfriend with him. And this guy owed me $5,000. And when I saw him, he had a bunch of jewelry on. He was with his girlfriend. She had a bunch of jewelry on. And I said, hey, man, where's my money at? Oh, I was going to pay you. And I took his jewelry. And his girlfriend happened to be there. And unfortunately, she got caught up in the situation. I had a bunch of young guys with me, and they robbed her as well. And he got hit in the head with the gun right here on the side of his head, and he got 2 stitches. And they gave me 25 years for that case.
Did you hit him in the head?
No. One of the guys that I was with hit him in the head. And he identified me in a photo array, unbeknownst to me. He identified me in a photo array. This guy, as far as I was concerned, he was in the streets just like I was. So in my mind at the time, this is a guy who I gave something to. He's living an illegal life. I'm living an illegal life. In hindsight, as I moved on and I became more mature and I began to reevaluate myself, I realized how wrong that was. But that was later on. At this time, I committed the crime and I just kept moving. Another guy that I ran into, he also owed me some money. He owed me $7,000, and it kind of went along the same ways. I got word that this is where he was at, and he was selling drugs, and I was going to get my money. And the same circumstances kind of ensued. Saw him, hey, what's going on? Reading in between the lines and outside the margins without really going into all of the details, I robbed him because he owed me $7,000.
Did he get physically hurt?
No. He didn't get touched. Got roughed up a little bit, but there was no physical harm, nothing.
So how do you rough somebody up but they didn't get touched? That whole conversation was weird as fuck. Out of all the wrongfully convicted people that Josh Dubin could have put on there with him, he chose this guy. I've got a lot more to say about that in a moment, but let me tell you about his father, because when I was reading up on him, something stuck out for me that I just could not get past, and it actually made me fucking angry. Sheldon's dad, Sheldon Sr., was a deaf crack addict who was also a convicted criminal. Listen to this though. Johnson Sr. separated from his wife in 1978 and started a family with another woman. In 1986, he was convicted of rape after sexually assaulting his 7-year-old stepdaughter 3 times because, quote, his second wife refused to have sexual relations with him because she was angry at his continued drug use. And get this, he was only given 5 years probation by the judge, who claimed that a harsher sentence, quote, would entail excessive hardship for his family who depended on him as the breadwinner. but he had to move out of the house due to a court order requiring Johnson Sr. to stay away from his stepdaughter. What the actual fuck? Bro, what is this? 5 years probation? What are we doing here, B? But let's get back to what Sheldon was just saying in those clips from JRE. That was his version. Now listen to what actually happened. Johnson committed a series of robberies targeting people that owed him unpaid protection money during his time in prison. During one such robbery, Johnson non-fatally shot a man in the back as he attempted to flee from him. He was arrested under the alias Thomas Smalls in Manhattan for possession of stolen property in 1997, and months later in December, he was arrested for attempted murder and robbery. In 1999, after rejecting a plea deal that would have had Johnson serve 23 years in prison, he received a sentence of 50 years without parole for 41 years. That's on fucking Wikipedia, guys. Did Rogan or Josh Dubin, who's an actual lawyer, bother to read that before letting Sheldon lie through his teeth on that episode? It gets worse though, because Sheldon has a son also named Sheldon who dodged a manslaughter charge at the age of 14. In April 2008, while his dad was imprisoned, his son, now 14 years old, also named Sheldon, was charged with manslaughter for the April Fool death of a 24-year-old Columbia University international student. He was struck and killed by a passing SUV as a result of Sheldon punching him in the back of the head in a random, unprovoked attack after being encouraged to do it by his friends. But he was not convicted, and instead, he was ordered to 18 months in a juvenile detention boot camp. So, with all of that bullshit in mind, you'd think Rogan and Dubin would finally admit that they fucked up, right?
I've had a lot of time to think about this, and I know you and I have discussed it privately, and I kind of went into a hole. My first thought was, I had two thoughts, was that poor guy that got killed, and it was a gruesome murder. You know, it wasn't just beheaded. I think he was dismembered completely.
Well, he was trying to get rid of the body, right?
Right.
Allegedly. What was the circumstances with the guy that he allegedly killed?
I don't know if I'm doing it just because I'm distancing myself from it subconsciously, but I don't know all the circumstances. But apparently this was someone he knew from childhood and from in prison. I've heard rumors and, you know, stories about the guy threatened his son to, he slashed Sheldon when they were in prison. I don't know if you remember, Sheldon had this big gash across his face. But I don't know. And I frankly don't want to know at this point because someone lost their life. You know, if I felt even remotely responsible for that, which I do, and, you know, I can be at peace with it, but I didn't cause that death.
Well, if the guy really did slash his face, if you've been in literal mortal combat with a person and this person is allegedly threatening your son or whatever, you know, there's only so much you can do to stop a person from seeking revenge.
I guess.
Especially if they don't have any hope outside of the system and they've been completely institutionalized. There's a reality of prison life. There's a reality of being incarcerated. There's a reality of taking a person who's convicted of a violent crime and putting them in jail with violent people for 30 years. There's just a reality. And, you know, I don't know what history he had with this man that he allegedly killed. You can only take so much.
Yeah, that's actually crazy. Reaching that hard to empathize with a psychopath is all kinds of fucked up. And let me just get one thing straight here. This is the thing that Rogan and Dubin refused to acknowledge as they sat there counseling each other and sniffing each other's farts. Nobody could have predicted that Sheldon Johnson was going to go off and commit such a gruesome murder. Allegedly. But the real issue for Josh is the fact that he was parading this convicted felon around as if he was a wrongfully convicted and now exonerated prisoner who was the victim of an unjust legal system and trigger-happy prosecutors. I've said this before about Josh Dubin's JRE appearances. I really enjoy them. Some of the wrongfully convicted guys that he brings in with him were so humble and forgiving. They were grateful for all the help and publicity surrounding their exonerations, and they just wanted to get back to their families and try to claw back what little time they have left. Sheldon Johnson is not that guy. I figured that out from just reading a couple of paragraphs on Wikipedia. Josh Dubin would have had access to all his files, his whole history, all the evidence against him, etc., yet he still thought this guy was a good example of the fine work him and his team have been doing. And even when he did stop and reflect on what this means for him and the work that he does, he still managed to fudge the figures and give himself yet another pass for being reckless.
I have to take a hard look at what I'm doing and take the mirror out and look straight in it and say, like, what did I do wrong?
You did nothing wrong.
Well,
I don't think you did anything wrong. You just listen. The man had great qualities. He like when you talk to him, he's very intelligent, very nice guy. He just thought he could get away with getting payback on somebody.
yeah, look, that's super gracious of you. He didn't let me down. Look, I was the public face of his resentencing. There was a lot of great people involved. There was nothing that raised a red flag for anyone. He didn't let anyone down. If he did this, people will draw their own conclusion, he'll have a trial. He didn't let anyone down if he did this but himself and the people that still need help. The recidivism rate for people that have served long sentences like that is less than 1%. It just happened to happen on a case where I was involved. I have no...
Is it really that low?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. If you look at exonerations, resentencings of people that have been incarcerated for more than 20 years, it's that low.
Okay, so when I heard Josh say that, I went down a bit of a rabbit hole and I ended up discovering that he was full of shit and stretched the truth to suit his own narrative. Let me explain for a moment. So, he said the recidivism rate for wrongfully convicted prisoners was less than 1%. Now, there isn't a lot of data to go off, but the consensus seems to be that the rates are much lower for the wrongfully convicted, so we'll give him that one. But he also threw in resentenced felons in there as well and tried to pass them off as having a low recidivism rate, which is just not true. Resentenced prisoners tend to have similar rates of reoffending to prisoners who see out their sentences and get released as normal. According to a study by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, about 68% of released prisoners were rearrested within 3 years and 77% within 5 years. So, trying to lump Sheldon Johnson into that 1% category of wrongfully convicted is straight up lies. But at the end of the day, Josh is working on the front lines, guys, and I'm just some dude on the internet, so he's probably right. I mean, after all, he's an expert when it comes to incarceration. He read a book about it when he was at college.
I can't apologize for giving someone a second chance and then, they squander it. All I can do is say, well, what could I have done better? I mean, I have a deep understanding, I think, of what incarceration means. I mean, I read this book. I always get his name confused. Is it Henry Jack Abbott or Jack Henry Abbott? It's called In the Belly of the Beast. When I was in college, I don't want to offer this as an excuse, but what it has caused me to do is reevaluate and say, look, maybe I need to take a much closer look at what sort of mental health counseling these folks are getting. Like Sheldon, I arranged for him to be speaking to a trauma therapist. Should I have been on him more to be going to those appointments? Maybe. I keep on sort of adding this disclaimer, and maybe this is my aversion to like getting attacked. I am not excusing if Sheldon did this. I just think that it's not so simple as, oh, you help some guy get out and get resentenced and look what he did and all these people and your movement. Okay, you're entitled to that opinion. That's where I leave it.
Yeah, you can't listen to those people.
One of the best things I did in the wake of this whole Sheldon Johnson incident is I turned comments off on Instagram and turned my account private. Turning comments off is a nice thing because you can't believe the good stuff or the bad stuff. You just stay forward.
Yep, that's right. Whenever you majorly fuck up, just disable the comment section and everything will go away. Except Jamie forgot to disable the comments on the episode here on YouTube. How dare Josh show up without a murderer? You can blame whoever you want, Dubin, but at the end of the day, the judge was right. Besides the body parts in the freezer and multiple other crimes, Sheldon Johnson is a good dude. Who could have known he was going to do that? I don't know, maybe the judge that called him a danger to society before this clown got him out. The comment section is 1,000 times better than the podcast in this case. He should have been left in jail. Some people can't be rehabilitated. Josh Dubin playing the victim couldn't be more repulsive. What a douche. I have a very deep understanding of what it's like to be in prison. I mean, I read this book. I can't believe Joe brought this guy back on. And as of recording, the podcast had around 6,000 dislikes to 10,000 likes, which is pretty high for an episode of JRE. But I just want to finish off with something I said earlier about how this reminded me of the conversations that Rogan has with his top 250 fake murderers, and it's that they can never take responsibility for any wrongdoing. I think that's what bothers me the most about JRE these days. When was the last time you've heard Rogan or one of his guests say, you know what, I messed up and I think I'm going to take some time off to reevaluate my decisions and take responsibility for the consequences of my actions. Instead, we get this circle jerk of apologists who gas each other up and pretend like they didn't do anything wrong. I mean, for Joe to sit there and tell Josh that he didn't do anything wrong and to just shut out the haters because they have limited information and don't know the full story is wild. It's actually the opposite. Josh had all the information and still made a bad decision, knowing the severity of Sheldon's crimes and the likelihood of him reoffending. But Josh is in the business of selling his narrative that these guys need a second chance, which might be true, but he definitely chose the wrong pinup boy, that's for sure. Anyway, make sure you go and check out the link in the description to my Patreon if you're interested in my longer form uncensored content. While you're here though, hit the subscribe button and make sure you give me a thumbs up if you ended up liking this video. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll catch you in the next one.
I promise the next time I bring a guest on, they will be vetted.
Yeah.
The guests will be vetted a lot more thoroughly.